Roll the bones in this Atari archive as we look at Backgammon. While not nearly as obviously exciting as Superman, the last two VCS games to come out in 1979 push boundaries in their own technical ways. Backgammon and Video Chess are both attempts to bring their respective strategy board games to a platform not suited for the necessary thought processes, or even displaying the game boards. Up to this point, bringing these types of games to the platform hadn't really been attempted. The closest is Codebreaker, but that doesn't have nearly the level of variables as these two, and is a much simpler game to display. Both Backgammon and Video Chess have intertwined development histories, but for the purposes of this series, we'll be talking about them separately. For the unfamiliar, the game of Backgammon dates back millennia, with 5,000-year-old precursors having been discovered in modern-day Iraq, in what was once Mesopotamia. Rule sets similar to the modern game have been written about as far back as the 400s, and it has only changed marginally since. Backgammon occupies interesting territory, as it's both a strategy game and a race game. Players are tasked with racing around the board to bear their pieces off the side first. The pieces are laid out to have equal numbers on both the player's inner and outer sides of the track, and pieces are moved with dice rolls. Rather than moving a piece the cumulative number on the two dice, however, players move with each die individually. If they roll, for example, a 2 and a 6, they must move pieces 2 times and 6 times if possible. Rolling doubles means the player must move that number 4 times if possible. Pieces of the same color can share a column, but a piece can only move into a space occupied by the other player if there is only one opposing piece, or blot, there already. In that instance, the opponent's piece is hit and removed to a central holding area, where it must be re-entered on that player's next turn if the dice rolls allow it. Once all your pieces are in the final quadrant of the board, you can begin bearing them off. Though not as popular a choice for early computer scientists to convert as chess, checkers, or NIM, Backgammon did eventually have some interest as a way to develop algorithms and showcase the power behind their machines. Backgammon is a unique challenge since it's also a dice-based game, making it harder for the computer to plan several steps ahead, as in chess or checkers. One of the earliest known backgammon computer programs was written in 1974 by Hans Berliner. Known as BKG, this PDP-10 computer-based program would be improved upon for several years, until BKG 9.8 managed to beat a world backgammon champion in July 1979, albeit thanks to favorable dice rolls. As new microcomputers entered the market in the 70s and 80s, backgammon would continue to pop up on new platforms, including home game consoles. Backgammon is the sole software outing from Craig Nelson for the VCS. Nelson didn't actually work in the same software development group as other game developers, such as David Crane or Jim Huather, but rather worked in engineer Bob Brown's Advanced Projects group. Nelson had initially worked for Brown as a summer hire in 1977, as Nelson had experience playing games like Colossal Cave Adventure over the ARPANET, and had even written a flight simulator with his roommate that allowed for air combat between two terminals. At the time, Brown was working on a follow-up to Atari's Video Music Machine that reduced its component count and brought Nelson in to assist. That project was killed when Atari bought a competing company's machine that could run dedicated console games off of carts. Nelson created a video music cartridge, but ultimately the whole thing was shelved. The following year, Nelson had finished school, and Brown hired him back in for his new group. What was an Advanced Projects group doing writing VCS software, you may be wondering? Well, Brown had been involved in the development of the VCS platform in the first place, among other pieces of hardware. But as Nelson explained it, once it was clear that there was a lot of money to be had on the VCS, Brown lost the political fight to stay involved, and was shuffled off to work on Phony, a high-speed modem that could be used to make video phones. Brown was able to carve out a niche for the VCS itself with Backgammon and Video Chess, as their group was allowed to use 4 kilobyte cartridges, and the games would most likely need that extra space. Larry Wagner, another VCS engineer and the main developer on Combat, took up chess, and Nelson was assigned Backgammon. Nelson admits that he knew nothing about Backgammon at the start, but learning the rules of the game wasn't the hard part. The first challenge was getting the machine to display the board, done through a hand-coded computer cycle routine like practically all VCS games. Nelson said that fortunately he didn't know that it was supposed to be difficult and was able to get the board working. More difficult was working within the 128 bytes of memory the VCS has to display the screen, keep track of the score, calculate moves, and evaluate the positions of the pieces on the board. In the end, Nelson gave up on trying to keep the board displayed at all times, and allowed for it to be blacked out for a few moments while the computer considers its move. This would become the standard solution for VCS takes on traditional strategic board games. Video Chess uses it at length, as will the 1980 release, Video Checkers. Nelson said the game fit rather nicely in the 4K of space thanks to efficient flowcharting. The game works like this. When the computer rolls the dice, it will generate all the legal moves and then determine which moves to make based on a weighting system Nelson had put into place. Some of these moves were obvious, like the level of exposure a piece has to the other player. But to determine more subtle move considerations, Nelson worked with Julio Kaplan, a chess master who was already working with Atari on video chess. Kaplan, as it turned out, was also a backgammon expert and very interested in computers attempting to translate these ancient board games. For the weighting system, Brown designed a program on their LSI-11, a cost-reduced PDP-11 CPU, that would process a training moveset and try to set the weighting to make the correct moves. Kaplan would then play the game, and when the computer made a bad move, he would tell it the correct move, and the weighting would be readjusted to make the moves he suggested. Eventually, this would take too long, so once the pieces had all passed each other on the board, Nelson implemented a canned mode where the computer would choose the moves that would move the most pieces across the quadrant and bear the most pieces off the board. He said it probably played a pretty poor game, but it would make surprising moves and people seemed to think that it was rather devious and enjoyed beating it. And indeed, playing this as a backgammon newcomer, the computer does indeed make for a decent foe. Nelson designed the game to use the paddle controllers, which made his bosses happy, and they work incredibly well to move the highlighter around in different columns. The computer is even willing to pull some devious moves, such as establishing what's known as a prime by occupying 6 consecutive columns that makes it impossible to move pieces past. And we'll even set these up on the entry points from the bar, creating a shutout. At the same time, the computer is entirely beatable if you keep yourself from getting locked down. And not content with standard backgammon rules, Nelson added a few common variations to the game. The first, and default, rule set involves the use of the doubling cube. In some circles, backgammon is played as a gambling game, but since experienced players can get a solid idea of who will end up winning within the first few turns, the doubling cube can be used to double the value of the bet in the game, signified here by a number in the upper left corner. After the first player moves, their opponent will be required to offer to double the wager to the game. If the first player accepts the offer, and the opponent is also fine with it, the bet increases and control of it moves to them. If the opponent refuses, then the game ends. Pushing reset begins the fresh game. You can play backgammon with or without the cube in case it's confusing, or ultimately unnecessary since it's not like you're gambling real money against your VCS. The cube may be a handier option if you've got a friend really interested in playing the game for money, but instead of having a board available, you've got this. The other additional rule set is known as AC-Deucey, and the manual insists it's a common form to the US Navy. This variation is unique in that all the pieces start in the bar and must be entered in from dice rolls. Additionally, any blots that get hit and returned to the bar do not need to be brought back onto the board before the player moves any other pieces. The other big change is that if a player rolls a 1 and a 2, the titular AC-Deucey, the player is allowed to move the 1 and 2 before selecting whichever doubles on the dice they find most useful and moving their pieces an additional 4 times. If this isn't enough, the player is then allowed another roll after any doubles, including if they get one from an AC-Deucey. The doubling cube is an option for these games as well, and all of these variations are playable with 2 players if you want to shut the computer out entirely. AC-Deucey is actually a really nifty variant that adds an extra layer of chaos to a game that's already defined by the dice, and games can turn around entirely with a few lucky rolls giving a player those extra moves. It's not faster paced per se, but it feels more active. Finally, by flipping the left and right difficulty switches, players also get the option to set up the pieces on the board however they want, and to specify what specific dice numbers they want, respectively. This is useful if you're just learning the game, want to practice specific situations, or just want to get the game unstuck on the rare occasions you get locked into only an illegal move, and the game won't let you continue. In normal play, however, the switches aren't terribly useful. Once completing backgammon, Nelson started work on a VCS speech synthesis program, but once Ray Kassar took over as Atari's president, he dissolved the entire Advanced Projects group. He had an offer to go to the coin-op development group, but between Kassar's flippant attitude towards developers and the sleazy corporate culture of sex and drugs that had existed at Atari up to that point, Nelson turned it down and left with Brown to work on a talking watch project for Hitachi. After bouncing around for a couple years working on a few different projects, the two of them would eventually return to the VCS as the co-designers of the Supercharger add-on under their own company Arcadia, shortly renamed to Starpath, where Nelson was in charge of software development. That's a story to be told in the future, whenever I'm working on 1982's releases. Regardless of technical challenges, Backgammon did show up on several platforms. The Channel F saw a version in 1977, as did the MP1000 in Television in the fall of 1979. The Channel F game is perhaps the most basic of the lot, featuring no computer opponent to speak of. While it plays reasonably well with two people, it's hard to recommend it over just getting a board and learning how to set it up. It does feature both the doubling cube mechanic and AC-DC, so it does have those things going for it. The Intellivision conversion excels at certain aspects of the game over its VCS counterpart, but doesn't have the same features. Specifically, there's no AC-DC and no doubling cube to be found here. It does change the control scheme to only jump your cursor between spaces you have pieces already. Once you've highlighted what you want, you push the button on the keypad corresponding with the dice roll number that you want to use, and the piece will move automatically. This one does feature a computer opponent, and a pretty competent one at that. Rather than blanking the screen, the game will simply make noises while the computer considers its next move, a process that takes about as long as the VCS version's computer blanking does. Coincidentally, this was a launch game for the first test markets that the Intellivision was sold at in November 1979, alongside Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack, Armor Battle, and Math Fun. Not the most stacked lineup, but if the goal was to showcase how much more sophisticated the platform was over its competition, it is a valiant effort. But at the time this launched, the VCS had just put out Superman and its own takes on chess and backgammon, so they may be prettier, but Armor Battle aside, they're not markedly different from what Atari was selling. The MP1000 backgammon game is most notable perhaps for being one of the rarer games on the platform. Coincidentally also coming out around November 1979, this version features a computer opponent and numbers each position. To move a piece, you input the column number on the keypad and then the number of spaces it's going to move. The joystick allows you to pass your turn if you have no moves, roll dice by pushing up, including for the computer, which can't roll on its own, and review the last move made by pushing left. The computer doesn't seem to be particularly special, but the move look back feature is pretty nifty. There are two other contemporary console conversions of Backgammon I want to touch on that are a bit unusual. The first is the Backgammon game for the Bally Professional Arcade. A first-party cartridge combining the game with checkers was advertised in 1979, but ultimately never came out. Some years later, the prototype for checkers turned up, and reproductions were offered up for sale by enthusiast Mike White, circa 1985. But as of this recording, the Backgammon game is still missing. The console did still get a version of the game, however. In January 1981, the independent game developer Wavemakers produced and sold a Bally Basic version of Backgammon on a cassette tape. This is actually a pretty solid rendition of the board game with a decent computer opponent for a beginning player such as myself. The only awkward part of the game is that if you miscount the number of spaces when you try to move a piece, the computer will plop your piece back at its starting point and punish you by using up that die. Punitive, but you can't be terribly choosy with a version written in BASIC using 1.8 kilobytes of RAM. Finally, the European version of the Odyssey 2, known as the Videopack G7000, received a backgammon conversion in 1982. This version uses some specific timing tricks to get the screen to display as many objects as it does properly, and as such doesn't run on its American counterpart. These tricks also mean it doesn't run properly in emulators, as they aren't accurate enough to get the display to work. As such, I have no footage or impressions of this game, unfortunately, but there's something to be said about using techniques so exacting to push a platform to its absolute limits for backgammon. While Superman and video chess got a lot more attention in late 1979, backgammon did still get highlighted in advertisements, initially as a game coming soon, at the time Superman was first being sold, before appearing in ads around November. The game was also mentioned in the October 1982 issue of Vidiot in the middle of a write-up of the major hardware platforms at the time. Atari had seemingly taken to branding it as part of a classics line, with its other traditional board game titles Video Chess, Video Checkers, Othello, and 3D Tic-Tac-Toe. 1982 was also the last year Warner-era Atari included Backgammon in its catalog listings, but the game continued to sell at least some copies in the system's twilight years. According to internal documents, Atari sold a bit over 16,200 copies of Backgammon between 1986 and 1990, with the game's sales peaking at about 15,000 copies in 1988. Not a big title by any means, but enough of one that the company got to move some product. And while Backgammon didn't have the same degree of editorial coverage as its fellow releases, it did get a review in the November 1979 edition of Creative Computing magazine. David Owl wrote that the game was a good choice for someone learning to play Backgammon, and provides a good challenge to a beginning to intermediate level player. As someone who literally learned to play Backgammon for this video, I will agree. It's a remarkably intuitive take on the game, even if the instructions in the manual leave something to be desired. I don't know who exactly is flipping on their VCS to play any of these traditional board game releases these days, but Backgammon is a pretty impressive achievement for a machine designed to run Pong. If nothing else, you have to give Nelson accolades for pulling that off. Next time, we close out 1979 with the impossible game.